Today, Japan stands as one of the most influential nations in the whole world. With their futuristic and world-renowned culture, the Japanese have captured the heart of many people across the globe. Of course, history has played a major role in shaping this relatively new country. After the Americans forced the opening of Japan in 1853, the nation would slowly rise to a hegemonic position by defeating the Qing in 1895 and the Russians just 10 years later, with them soon after joining the Allies in World War I, seizing the German colonies in the region. They would then increasingly involve themselves in the mess that was the Chinese warlord era, eventually having secured Manchuria, East Hebei and Menjiang by 1937. In that year in turn, the Japanese would stage an incident that would be used to justify an invasion of the Republic of China, kickstarting World War II in Asia. Quickly, Japan would move to occupy large parts of China, including the capital Nanjing, where they committed horrific atrocities against the civilian populations of the city. Meanwhile, in Europe, as Germany annexed Austria, invaded Czechoslovakia and conquered Poland, they turned their attention towards France, overrunning the country in just 6 weeks. This would leave the French colony of Indochina isolated, which the Japanese would take advantage of, allowing them to rapidly conquer the area. However, this would be a step too far for the Americans, and as such they would issue an embargo towards the Japanese Empire. This of course would not deter the Japanese High Command, as instead of giving up they'd launch a surprise attack on the American base of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. With this, the Americans had enough and would then formally join the Allies, but it would take several months for the US to rebuild, and while that's happening, Japan would strike down into the European colonies in the region. With the added resources from the colonies and especially the oil extracted from the rich Indonesia, the Japanese would be able to continue their war effort for a couple more years, although their progress would soon come to a halt. At the same time, in Europe, with America now directly involved in the World War, Germany would begin to face pushbacks from all sides as the Soviets advanced westwards and the Allies managed to liberate France from Axis occupation. Despite all the progress though, the Americans had bigger ambition: the development of an atomic bomb that would be used on Germany to put an end to the war instantly. However, before the project could be finished, the Germans would surrender in May 1945. With Germany out of the picture, the Allies would shift their focus over to the Japanese. By this point, Japan began to face enormous resource shortages and the Allied victory seemed inevitable. In spite of that, the Japanese would still fight on as to prevent unconditional surrender, something that the US was not going to give up on under any circumstances. As such, a plan had to be devised on how to finally put an end to the conflict, and as such, Operation Downfall was thus proposed. The operation primarily consisted of the US leading a costly invasion of the Japanese home islands, forcing them to sign peace right there and then. That is until the Manhattan Project is finally finished and the United States has acquired its first nukes. As a testing ground for this new weapon, in the first atomic bombing of history, Hiroshima would be completely wiped off the map, followed soon after by a second bomb delivered on Nagasaki. This, combined with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, would force Japan to accept defeat and announce unconditional surrender on August 15, 1945. In the aftermath of the war, unlike Germany and Korea, Japan would come under complete American occupation. It is under these circumstances that Japan would be shaped as we know it today, with their constitution being modeled after the American one, allowing for free speech, limiting censorship in media, ensuring the demilitarization of the state, etc., etc. Emperor Hirohito would also be allowed to remain in power, but as a ceremonial figurehead rather than an an actual political leader. Japan would turn into a pacifist democratic stronghold in East Asia, the heart of US influence on the continent. During the Cold War, Japan would play a major role in the region and the whole world, with the Americans helping to reconstruct the country as an economic miracle set in, which pretty much brings us to the modern day. But did it have to be this way? Historically, before the Japanese surrendered to the Allies, the original plan was to divide the nation in a similar fashion to Germany, with the North falling under the Soviet sphere of influence, while the South under American one. As you may know, this never happened for many reasons, including the fear of communism spreading in the area, the Soviets not having occupied any territory of the country, the sheer strategic importance of the islands towards the US, and much more. Still, this does raise the obvious question: what if Japan was divided between the victorious powers after the Second World War? For starters, how could this happen in the first place? Well, the US was not going to give away half of Japan over to the Soviets for seemingly no reason. And the only way for something like this to happen is if the Soviets established themselves on the island before the eventual surrender of the Japanese. As such, would need Operation Downfall to actually be executed, which in my opinion is not quite hard to imagine. The Japanese viewed surrendering as the biggest form of humiliation, and considering just how insane the Japanese high command was during the time, we can simply have them ignore the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and continue to fight on as if nothing is happening. Now, assuming that the US government doesn't do anything radical, such as continuing to nuke even more Japanese cities including Tokyo until Japan surrenders anyway, the stage is set for one of the bloodiest invasions in all of history. Initially, the US would focus on Kyushu Island, landing forces there by the end of August, while the Soviets by the same time would have taken over Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, and are now preparing for their own naval invasion of Hokkaido. On the Asian mainland then, with the war still raging on, the USSR would take the opportunity to not only conquer Manchuria, but the entirety of the Korean peninsula. In general, progress is quite slow for the Americans as they fail to make any significant gains into Japan proper. This would result in a second landing being planned, this time near Tokyo, where the US hopes to march into the city and force the Japanese to surrender that way. Back north, the Soviets have managed to land a force in Hokkaido, quickly overrunning the undefended Japanese position, opening the gates to the island of Honshu for the communists. The United States, now wary of Japan falling under the Soviet sphere of influence, would negotiate with the USSR a division of the country, with the US getting everything below the Tohoku region. With this, America would get to execute its naval invasion of Honshu, soon after capturing Tokyo and forcing the Emperor to surrender. But before we continue, if you're enjoying the content thus far, consider subscribing. It is the channel's goal to reach 6,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so doing so will mean a lot. Anyways, let's get back with the video. With this, World War II has come to an end and Japan would be divided as per the agreement made earlier, with differences already showing between the two sides. In the south, the American occupation would see a similar reconstruction effort as it did in our timeline, but with one major change. With the north of the country falling under communist rule, South Japan is now extremely vulnerable to any sort of invasion, and as such would need to be strengthened significantly. Already in our timeline, the US allowed the Japanese to remilitarize in a limited capacity after the occupation, and here this would only be more radical. Expect South Japan to remain a militarized power, which would have profound effects on the culture of the nation, with pacifism never becoming as prominent as it did in our timeline. The North, meanwhile, is a whole different story. Under the Soviet occupation, North Japan would see major persecution of any imperial sympathizers, while the country would be rebuilt from the ground up, with it mimicking East Germany and North Korea in many ways. Likely, Sanzo Nosaka, a prominent member of the Communist Party of Japan, would be put in charge, before quickly installing a secret police similar to the KGB of the USSR, making his job of controlling the state much easier. On top of that, with North Japan being limited to trade with only fellow Soviet-aligned states, they would be as a result much poorer, and as collective farming would dominate agriculture, with Hokkaido's fertile land being the primary source of food production, North Japan may also experience famines as a result of insufficiencies with most Soviet-styled collective farming system. The government would also use the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as propaganda fuel, helping to maintain control over the masses, whilst the military would become central to the structure of this new state, as similarly to the South, the North would also fear a potential invasion. Zooming out, though in this timeline Japan may be divided in two, you know who isn't divided? That's right, it's Korea, with the whole nation falling under the control of Kim Il-sung, which is surprisingly much more stable than it was in our timeline. As you may know, after the Japanese surrendered in World War II, Korea was forcefully divided, with the two countries soon after fighting each other in the infamous Korean War. This war would see the both sides completely exhaust themselves, with the conflict ending in no victor. However, in the long term, South Korea was clearly the winner, as with the help of the US they were able to rebuild themselves and become the wealthy nation they are known for today. In stark contrast, the North would radicalize, becoming more and more authoritarian and militaristic, with money being pumped into war equipment rather than feeding the population. But things could end up being very different in this scenario. With the Korean War absent from this world, Korea is off to a significantly calmer start, which may have profound implications for the future of the DPRK. The cult of personality around the Kim family, for example, may be butterflied away, while the military would become much less significant, especially considering that Korea, by virtue of its location, is surrounded by friendly nations. Depending on how the Cold War progresses in this timeline, should Korea align itself with China and slowly model their state after them, the DPRK may even come to rival modern-day South Korea in terms of economy. But of course, this is assuming the best case scenario for them. Although, that's not to say that this alternate communist Korea is suddenly a democratic and prosperous paradise. Far from it actually. Despite the stronger base, the DPRK would still obviously be a one-party state, and any political opposition would most definitely be stamped down upon, while religious communities would face a similar fate. The country would also make for a useful buffer between China and South Japan, making it a major point of contention during the Cold War. Overall, I personally don't believe that these changes will impact the general trajectory of the Cold War all too much, but the details are most certainly different, which I will not even try to predict anything for. So instead, let's skip over to the fall of communism and see the broad effects this has on Japan, assuming everything else is the same. Even before the fall of the USSR, calls for reunification would be loud on both sides, and should a figure similar to Gorbachev come to power in the Soviet Union, the division between the two Japans is likely not to last. Of course, there is always the possibility that this doesn't happen, but I will discuss this outcome in a bit. Fact is, under these circumstances, a Japanese reunification is pretty much inevitable. With this, we pretty much have our timeline's Japan, but significantly poorer. Furthermore, though the border between the two countries may have fallen politically, the impact of the communists cannot be understated. In turn, Externally, Japan would be divided between two separate worlds, as the way of life, customs, beliefs and traditions may have all diverged from one another. But at the end of the day, as time passes by and the division of the country becomes more and more distant, these changes would slowly fade away, leaving Japan united externally and internally once more. But this doesn't have to happen, though I do consider it the most likely scenario. Instead, let's go back to the start of the Cold War and discuss a timeline where the two Japans go to war, in a similar fashion to Korea of our timeline. This opens the door for several possibilities, but for the purposes of this scenario, I'll only explore the outcomes of a stalemate, as should one side emerge victorious, the country would end up united, and that goes against what the scenario promised. So, around the early 1950s, I expect North Japan to initiate the civil conflict, which would turn disastrous for them. Unlike South Korea of our timeline, South Japan would actually have the strength to repel the communist forces, quickly driving them out of Honshu proper. This would obviously cause a panic within the Soviet Union, as they are on the brink of losing a valuable ally in Asia, and as a result would join the war on the side of North Japan. Soon, Soviet troops would flood the front lines, pushing the South out of most of Honshu, which would prompt the US to level up their aid towards South Japan. After some back and forth, we can expect a ceasefire to be called and the border to return to how it was previously. The South, having the backing of the United States, is likely to recover extremely quickly after the end of the conflict. The same cannot be said for the North, however, which under the communists is likely to radicalize in a similar way to North Korea. If by then the nation wasn't already a highly militaristic totalitarian dictatorship, it most certainly will turn into one now. Now, on top of the changes mentioned earlier, the differences grow yet stronger, with North Japan falling behind as the South experiences an economic boom. After the Cold War, I don't see the two nations uniting anytime sooner, as China would make use of this opportunity to influence the North, making it the perfect pawn for the Chinese to use as a counter to American influence in Asia. Whatever the future ends up being for this world, one thing is for certain: Japan is headed into a much darker and horrific path than the prosperity it enjoyed in our history. But with that, I will end the scenario here. I hope you enjoyed the content, and if you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe and comment below what you thought of the video. And as always, don't forget to join the Discord linked in the description below. Anyways, that's all for now, goodbye and have a great rest of your day.